Today we have some more actual history about some of the earliest American pioneers, Andrew and Adam Poe. These two brothers were skilled backwoodsmen who served as Indian fighters along the frontier of western Pennsylvania, northeast Ohio, and West Virginia. Today we will read a story about their fights with an Indian chief known as Bigfoot, who stood at or near 7 feet tall, and was broadly proportioned. Chief Bigfoot had led a raid on one of the settlements, and the Poe brothers had organized a party to track them down and bring back an old man that the Indians had taken prisoner. We will be reading from this book, History of the Early Settlements and Indian Wars of West Virginia. This book was published by Wills de Haas all the way back in 1851. This was the book that we read a sketch about Louis Wetzel from in a previous episode on this channel, and this story about the Poe brothers' fight with Chief Bigfoot comes right after the story about Louis Wetzel's life in this book. So here's the story of Andrew and Adam Poe, and their fight with Chief Bigfoot of the Wyandots, all the way back in 1781. A most formidable and fearful man was the Vanquisher of Bigfoot. Of those who settled at an early day on the Ohio River, near the extreme upper corner of Virginia, were two brothers, Andrew and Adam Poe. They were born near the present town of Frederick, Maryland, and emigrated to the West in 1774. Adam was the elder by some 5 years. He lived to the age of 93, and died in 1840. These brothers were backwoodsmen in every sense of the word. They were shrewd, active, and courageous, and having their abodes on the frontier of civilization, determined to contest inch by inch with the Indians their right to the soil and their privilege to live. In appearance they were tall, muscular, and erect, with features indicating great strength of character. Andrew, in the general contour of his face, differed somewhat from that of his brother, while the freshness of his color indicated a better degree of health than the sallow complexion of the other. Both, however, were endowed with an unusual degree of strength, and woe to the man who dared engage in single combats with either. Early in the fall of 1781, there was an occurrence on the Ohio, which stamped the character of one as a man of no ordinary make. The place of combat was near the mouth of Tomlinson's Run, and about 2 miles below Yellow Creek. A few months since we visited the spot, and obtained from a member of the family the particulars of that celebrated conflict, which we now give. During the summer of 1781, the settlements in the region indicated suffered not a little from Indian depredation. At length it was ascertained that a party of 6 warriors had crossed the river, and committed sundry outrages, among the rest killing a defenseless old man in his cabin. The people became aroused, and it was at once determined to raise a force and intercept the retreat of the Indians. 8 determined spirits at once volunteered, and placing themselves under Captain Andrew Poe, as he was then called, were ready for action in 5 minutes' notice. Early on the following morning they found the trail of the enemy, and detected among the footprints those of a celebrated chief called Bigfoot, who was distinguished for his daring, skill, eloquence, and immense size. He stood literally like the tall man of Tarsus, a head above his peers, for he is said to have been nearly or quite 7 feet in height, and large in proportion. The feet of this giant were so large as to gain for him the name of Bigfoot. Andrew Poe, delighted at the prospect of testing his strength with so renowned a chief, urged the pursuit with unabated zeal, until brought within a short distance of the enemy. For the last few miles the trail had led up the southern bank of the Ohio, where the footprints in the sand were deep and obvious, but then within a few hundred yards of the point at which the Indians were in the habit of crossing, it suddenly diverged from the stream, and stretched along a rocky ridge, forming an obtuse angle with its former direction. Here Andrew halted for a moment, and directed his brother and the other young men to follow the trail with proper caution, while he still adhered to the river path, which led through a cluster of willows directly to the point where he supposed the enemy to lie. Having examined the priming of his gun, he crept cautiously through the bushes, until he had a view of the point of embarkation. Here lay 2 canoes, empty and apparently deserted. Being satisfied, however, that the Indians were close at hand, he relaxed nothing of his vigilance, and quickly gained a jutting cliff which hung over the canoes. Hearing a low murmur below, he peered cautiously over, and beheld the object of his search. The gigantic Bigfoot lay below him, in the shade of a willow, and was talking in a low, deep tone to another warrior, who seemed a mere pygmy by his side. Andrew cautiously drew back and cocked his gun. The mark was fair. The distance did not exceed 20 feet, and his aim was unerring. Raising his rifle slowly and cautiously, he took a steady aim at Bigfoot's breast, and drew the trigger. His gun flashed. Both Indians sprung to their feet with a deep interjection of surprise, and for a single second all three stared upon each other. This inactivity, however, was soon over. Andrew was too much hampered by the bushes to retreat, and setting his life upon the cast of the die, sprung over the bush which had sheltered him, and summoning all his powers, leaped boldly down the precipice, and alighted on the breast of Bigfoot with a shock which bore him to the earth. At the moment of contact, Andrew had also thrown his right arm around the neck of the smaller Indian, so that all three came to the earth together. At that moment a sharp firing was heard among the bushes above, announcing that the other parties were engaged, but the trio below were too busy to attend to anything but themselves. Bigfoot was for an instant stunned by the violence of the shock, and Andrew was unable to keep them both down. But the exertion necessary for that purpose was so great that he had no leisure to use his knife. Bigfoot quickly recovered, and without attempting to rise, wrapped his long arms around Andrew's body, and pressed him to his breast with the crushing force of a boa constrictor. Andrew, as we have already remarked, was a powerful man, and had seldom encountered his equal, but never had he felt an embrace like that of Bigfoot. He relaxed his hold of the small Indian who sprung to his feet. Bigfoot then ordered him to run for his tomahawk, which lay within 10 steps, and kill the white man while he held him in his arms. Andrew, seeing his danger, struggled manfully to extricate himself from the folds of the giant, but in vain. The lesser Indian approached with his uplifted tomahawk, but Andrew watched him closely, and as he was about to strike, gave him a kick so sudden and violent as to knock the tomahawk from his hand, and sent him staggering back into the water. Bigfoot uttered an exclamation in a tone of deep contempt at the failure of his companion, and raising his voice to its highest pitch, thundered out several words in the Indian tongue, which Andrew could not understand, but supposed to be a direction for a second attack. The lesser Indian now again approached, carefully shunning Andrew's heels, and making many motions with his tomahawk in order to deceive him as to the point where the blow would fall. This lasted for several seconds, until a thundering exclamation from Bigfoot compelled his companion to strike. Such was Andrew's dexterity and vigilance, however, that he managed to receive the tomahawk in a glancing direction upon his left wrist, wounding him deeply but not disabling him. He now made a sudden and desperate effort to free himself from the arms of the giant, and succeeded, instantly snatching up a rifle, for the Indian could not venture to shoot, for fear of hurting his companion. He shot the lesser Indian through the body, but scarcely had he done so when Bigfoot arose and, placing one hand upon his shoulder and the other upon his leg, threw him violently upon the ground. Before his antagonist could spring upon him, he was again upon his feet, and, stung with rage at the idea of being handled so easily, he attacked his gigantic antagonist with a fury which, for a time, compensated for inferiority of strength. It was now a fair fist-fight between them, for in the hurry of the struggle neither had leisure to draw their knives. Andrew's superior activity and experience as a pugilist gave him great advantage. The Indian struck awkwardly, and finding himself rapidly dropping to the leeward, he closed in with his antagonist, and again hurled him to the ground. They quickly rolled into the river, and the struggle continued with unabated fury, each attempting to drown the other. The Indian, being unused to such violent exertion, and having been much injured by the first shock in his stomach, was unable to exert the same powers which had given him such a decided superiority at first. And Andrew, seizing him by the scalp lock, put his head under water, and held it there, until the faint struggle of the Indian induced him to believe that he was drowned, when he relaxed his hold and attempted to draw his knife. The Indian, however, to use Andrew's own expression, had only been possuming. He instantly regained his feet, and in his turn put his adversary under. In the struggle, both were carried out into the current beyond their depth, and each was compelled to relax his hold and swim for his life. There was still one loaded rifle upon the shore, and each swam hard in order to reach it, but the Indian proved the most expert swimmer, and Andrew, seeing that he should be too late, turned and swam out into the stream, intending to dive and thus frustrate his enemy's intention. At this instant, Adam, having heard that his brother was alone in a struggle with two Indians, and in great danger, ran up hastily to the edge of the bank above, in order to assist him. Another white man followed him closely, and seeing Andrew in the river covered with blood, and swimming rapidly from shore, mistook him for an Indian, and fired upon him, wounding him dangerously in the left shoulder. Andrew turned, and seeing his brother, called loudly to him to shoot the Indian upon the shore. Adam's gun, however, was empty, having just been discharged. Fortunately, Bigfoot had also seized the gun with which Andrew had shot the lesser Indian, so that both were upon an equality. The contest now was who should beat at loading, the Indian exclaiming, "Who load first, shoot first." Bigfoot got his powder down first, but in the excitement of drawing the ramrod out, it slipped through his fingers and fell into the river. The noble Indian, now feeling that all was over, faced his foe, pulled open the bosom of his shirt, and the next instant received the ball of his adversary fair in his breast. Adam, alarmed for his brother, who was scarcely able to swim, threw down his gun and rushed into the river, in order to bring him ashore. But Andrew, more intent upon securing the scalp of Bigfoot as a trophy than upon his own safety, called loudly upon his brother to leave him alone and scalp the big Indian, who was endeavoring to roll himself into the water from a romantic desire peculiar to the Indian warrior of securing his scalp from the enemy. Adam, however, refused to obey, and insisted upon saving the living before attending to the dead. Bigfoot, in the meantime, had succeeded in reaching the deep water before he expired, and his body was borne off by the waves, without being stripped of the ornament and pride of an Indian warrior. The death of Bigfoot was a severe blow to his tribe, and is said to have thrown them all into mourning. He was an able and noble chief, and often rendered signal service to the whites by reclaiming prisoners from the stake, and otherwise averting the doom which his tribe seemed determined to visit upon their captives. Poe recovered from his wounds, and lived until within about 20 years. We have recently seen a gentleman who often witnessed Poe go through the fight, and he declares the scene was the most thrilling he ever beheld. He says the old man would enter into the spirit of the conflict, and with dilated pupil, contracted muscle, and almost choked with foaming saliva, would go through every motion and distinct feature of that terrible fight. He describes the appearance of these pantomime exhibitions as most painfully interesting, and declares that the old man would be as much exhausted after the performance as though the scene had been actual. Andrew Poe was certainly an extraordinary man, and his impressive character is still visible in the region where he lived. An incident is related as occurring shortly before his death, which strongly marked the character of the man. Among his cattle was a fierce and powerful young bull, endangering the life of anyone who went near him. Poe, however, then a man of advanced age, would visit his stockyard regardless of the animal in question, until he supposed it knew him. On one occasion the refractory animal made at Poe, and before he could get out of reach, received a severe wound from one of its horns. So exasperated was this singular man that he went at once to his house, armed himself with a tomahawk, and despite the entreaties of his family, returned to the yard, and driving all the cattle out but the one alluded to, faced it, and with a menacing scowl, laid hold of the right horn. The animal plunged and attempted to break loose, but Poe held on, and at every favorable opportunity struck him with the pipe end of his tomahawk. In this way he repeated his blows, until finally the animal sunk dead at his feet. Mr. Poe during his whole life was a most active and useful man. He lived about 1 mile from Hookstown, Pennsylvania, where many of his descendants still reside. So that is the story of the Poe brothers and their fight with Chief Bigfoot of the Wyandots, from Wills de Haas's 1851 book, History of the Early Settlements and Indian Wars of West Virginia. These events took place in 1781, near the end of the United States Revolution. I also found some more information about the Poe brothers and about this raid by the Wyandots from this book, History of Belmont and Jefferson Counties, Ohio, and Incidentally, Historical Collections Pertaining to Border Warfare and the Early Settlements of the Adjacent Portion of the Ohio Valley. This book was written by J.A. Caldwell and published in 1880. So here are some more details about the raid by the Wyandots which led to the fight with Chief Bigfoot, and about what happened to the Poe brothers after the fight. The names of Andrew and Adam Poe long since became famous throughout the length and breadth of the land, in consequence of the desperate encounter with two Indians on the banks of the Ohio River, one of whom gained an equal celebrity under the name of Bigfoot. The narrations of the famous combats that appeared in old books on border warfare, and those handed down by tradition, are full of conflicting statements, and much that has been published is totally unreliable. It is the purpose of this sketch to correct some of those errors, and after describing the memorable events, to add some facts pertaining to the history of the story of Poe and Bigfoot. Andrew Poe was born in Frederick County, Maryland, September 30th, 1742. His father, George Poe, possessed a large property in that county, but was murdered by an Irishman in his employ when Andrew was 14 years of age. Soon after Andrew became of age, finding he would get none of his father's estate, he left his mother and brother with whom he had still lived, and came to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and worked in that neighborhood for several years, until he acquired a little property. He then, in company with two young men, went to Harmon's Creek, in Washington County, Pennsylvania, then Virginia, where each of them selected for himself a tract of land, and commenced making the first improvements in that part, and pursued their labor undisturbed for several years. Adam Poe was 6 years younger than Andrew. When he became of age, Andrew returned to Maryland, and induced him to come to Harmon's Creek, and Adam also took up a farm, and their little settlement increased to 10 or 12 families. Adam Poe was married in 1778, and Andrew in 1780. The Indians became very troublesome about this time. This little settlement was about 12 miles back from the Ohio River. The Indians very often came across the river into the settlement in small parties, and killed a number of the inhabitants. Such as were active on foot went in small scouting parties into the Indian settlements, to learn their strength and retaliate their injuries. Andrew Poe frequently went on these excursions, as he was of a daring spirit, and inured to all the perils of the woods. Early in the month of August, the Wyandots, Delawares, Shawnees, and other Indians, with over 300 warriors, assembled at the Moravian towns on the Muskingum, now Tuscaroras, for the purpose of making prisoners of the missionaries and Christian Indians, and carrying them to Sandusky. The scheme also being to take the missionaries Heckewelder, Zeisberger, and others to Detroit, and try them as spies against the British government. The ostensible leader of the expedition was the Half-King, the principal chief of the Wyandots. After remaining at the Moravian towns for about a month, the warriors started on their return with their prisoners. On the 20th of September, after having reached a point some distance up the Walhonding River, the Half-King sent out a party of 7 young Wyandot warriors, among which were 3 of his sons, to make a stroke upon the white settlers across the Ohio River. They proudly set out upon their expedition, crossed the river, penetrated the settlements in the neighborhood of the Poes, and broke into the house of William Jackson, a man about 60 years of age. He being alone in the house, they took him prisoner. Jackson's son, a young man about 17 years of age, who had left the cabin a short time previously, on returning discovered the Indians having his father a prisoner in the yard, and, unobserved by them, fled to the fort on Harmon's Creek to give the alarm. This took place as evening was approaching. The Indians then tried to break into a house in the same vicinity where several men were lodging, but failing to get in, they made off with their prisoner. During the contest between Andrew Poe and the 2 Indians, the rest of the party followed the Indian trail to the river, where the other 5 Indians were with the prisoner Jackson. They had a large raft and were preparing to cross the river. Jackson, seeing the men coming as soon as the Indians did, ran to them. One of the Indians, having a tomahawk, ran after him and struck him on the back, making but a slight wound. The men fired on the Indians, who returned the fire and plunged into the river. They did not capture any of the Indians, but being badly wounded, only one of them got across the river. The Indians firing at our men wounded but one of them. He was shot slightly through the side, but the ball cut his lungs, and he died in about an hour. His name was Cherry. The party took the dead man Cherry and Andrew Poe up the river to the horses, and then took them on horseback home. Andrew Poe was straight and tall, being 6 feet and 2 inches tall, with large bones covered with well-developed sinews and muscles, and though he weighed over 200 pounds, he carried no superfluous flesh. Broad shoulders, slightly rounded, and a deep, full chest were surmounted by a large and well-balanced head, the whole physique indicating great strength and extraordinary power of endurance. His large hazel eyes, slightly aquiline nose, and thin, compressed lips indexed the firmness and strength for which he was distinguished. Subsequent to his fight with the Indians, he sold his possessions on Harmon's Creek, and purchased a tract of land lying near Hookstown in Beaver County, Pennsylvania, to which he removed in 1790. The cabin in which he lived having been burned by the Indians during his absence from home, he built in 1795 a large 2-story, hewed log house. The upper story was left without windows, and was intended as a kind of fort, in case of an attack by the Indians, and as a general storehouse for provisions, grain, gears, saddles, and other things likely to be carried off by the Indians. This house is still standing, and is occupied by one of his descendants. It is in a good state of preservation, only 2 of the logs on the west end showing any signs of decay. The portholes pierced in either ends, though filled up with brick, are plainly visible. Some of the heavy pins put in the walls upon which to hang harness, and also 2 brackets made of forks of dogwood limbs, upon which he hung his trusty rifle, still remain as he left them. The oaken floor was made of board sawed from the log by a whipsaw, and is fastened down with wrought iron nails. It is sound and solid, and looks as though it might last until another centennial. No one can look upon this old building, that has stood while nearly 4 generations have passed away, and not regard it with feelings of interest. It is one of the few remaining links connecting the present with the heroic generation of the past century. Andrew Poe was a member of the Presbyterian Church at Mill Creek, Beaver County, Pennsylvania, during all or the greater part of the pastorate of the Reverend George Scott, which lasted for over 40 years. After a short illness, he died in peace in 1831, at his residence above described, and his remains lie buried in the cemetery connected with Mill Creek Church. Adam Poe was not so tall as his brother, but physically was equally well formed, but differed more widely from him in his social temperament. After removing from Harmon's Creek, he settled at the mouth of Little Beaver, on the west side of the Ohio River. While residing here, a circumstance occurred never before published, illustrative of his strength and courage. 4 Indians had gone over to Georgetown and got drunk, and having returned, slept off the effects of their intoxication on the river bank. When they had sobered up, they demanded of Mr. Poe their guns. He told them he knew nothing about them. At this they got angry and commenced coming into the yard with the intention of attacking him. But as fast as they entered, he caught them and threw them over the fence. He repeated this 2 or 3 times. Then, going into his cabin, he told his wife to take the children and flee into the cornfield, that he would stay and defend the house. He seized his gun and pointed it at the approaching Indians, who, seeing their danger, fled to the woods, and gave him no further trouble. It was also while he lived at this place that the Wyandots determined to assassinate him in revenge for their loss in this affair, and detailed one of their most fearless warriors to accomplish the deed. On the arrival of the Indian, Poe received him with friendship, and showered him with the kindest attention. Poe's cabin contained but 1 room, as they were built in those days, and but 2 beds, one for himself and wife, and a smaller one for the children. In the evening, the Indian intimated a desire to remain all night, if Poe and his wife did not object, when they assured him he was perfectly welcome, and made up a pallet on the floor before a huge log fire. Romulus, which was the Indian's name, lay awake until he was satisfied that the family were asleep. After struggling with various emotions for an hour, he arose and cautiously approached the bed, in which Poe and his wife were sleeping. Catching a glimpse of the faces of his intended victims, from the rays of the moon shining through a window near the bed and falling upon them, as he raised his tomahawk to deal the fatal blow, he was so impressed with the perfidy of the act, and so overcome by the recollection of the kindness that had been shown him, that his heart relented, and he returned to his resting place and slept till morning. This Indian was a relative of the large Indian that Poe had killed, and traveled over 100 miles to avenge his death by killing Poe, but spared his life through kindness. He had often attended the Christian Indians' meeting at their town on the Sandusky, and there probably had received the germ of their religion. After wandering with the missionary Zeisberger for several years, he came to Goshen in 1798, a convert, and there died. From Little Beaver, Adam Poe moved to a place 6 miles west of New Lisbon, and from thence to Wayne County, Ohio. After residing here a few years, the infirmities of age led him to seek a home with his eldest son, Andrew, a father of the late Adam Poe of the M.E. Church. He died at Massillon, Ohio in 1840, at the age of 96. When dying, he closed his own eyes with his fingers, then quietly passed away. So that's it for this episode about Andrew and Adam Poe and their fight with Chief Bigfoot of the Wyandot Indians. One thing that was unclear about Andrew Poe's fight with Bigfoot was whether he hit him when he shot him at the very beginning of the fight. There was a reference to Chief Bigfoot being hurt in the stomach, so perhaps the bullet hit him there. Adam Poe's Find a Grave website page says that he was an Indian spy or scout who watched the Indians to try to infer what their plans were for attacking the white settlements. Adam served in both the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. It also says that during Adam Poe's funeral, the gun that he had shot Chief Bigfoot with stood in the corner of the room. This episode was based on a request from one of the descendants of one of these Poe brothers that was left as a comment to one of our videos. I remembered seeing the story of the Poe brothers right after the story of Lewis Wetzel in Wills DeHaas's book on West Virginia history. The Poes lived at about the same time and place as Lewis Wetzel, but it is unclear if they ever met or associated with each other. Let us know in the comments if you have ever heard of a story where the Poe brothers interacted with Lewis Wetzel. Also, let us know what you think about Andrew and Adam Poe and their fight with Chief Bigfoot. This channel is called Unworthy History because we cover actual history that has now been deemed unworthy to discuss on history channels on TV. Here on this channel, you will be able to hear tales of our history directly from old books, written down long ago, by people whose shoes we are unworthy to stand in. If you'd like to support the mission of our channel, then you can join our Patreon page or become a YouTube channel member. Members will have full access to all of our members-only videos, and your contribution towards keeping actual history alive will be recognized at the end of each episode. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.